For decades, deterrence in the Middle East operated on a simple but unspoken rule: nobody had to prove what they could do, only threaten what they might. Ambiguity was the currency of power. A missile arsenal left partially hidden, a red line left deliberately vague, a retaliation left to the imagination of the adversary. This uncertainty was not a weakness. It was the entire architecture of restraint. Iran's latest missile strike broke that architecture in a single moment. This was not simply an attack on a target. It was a demonstration. Precise, deliberate, and impossible to walk back. And that distinction matters more than most coverage has acknowledged. When a threat becomes a demonstrated capability, the psychological game shifts entirely. Adversaries no longer have to guess. They now have to recalculate, using confirmed data instead of assumption. So the question this documentary explores is not simply what was hit or why. It is something larger. What happens to deterrence itself once the bluff is gone? Israel, the United States, and the Gulf states all built their regional strategies around a version of Iran that operated in shadows. Through proxies, through ambiguity, through calculated restraint, that version may no longer exist. What replaces it is uncertain. But one thing is already clear: the old rules that governed restraint, escalation, and retaliation across the region are being rewritten in real time. To understand how we arrived at this moment, and why it matters far beyond the missile itself, we need to look at exactly what happened and who was watching. What is publicly confirmed is this: Iran launched a missile strike targeting a location its leadership described as a legitimate military objective. The strike was significant enough to draw immediate statements from Tehran, from Israeli officials, and from Washington within hours. Beyond these confirmed facts, much of the surrounding detail remains contested, filtered through competing narratives designed to shape perception as much as inform it. That distinction matters. In moments like this, the first statements released are rarely neutral. Tehran's framing emphasized deterrence and defensive necessity. Israeli officials characterized the strike differently, focused on the scale of the threat it represented. Washington's response, more measured in tone, signaled concern without committing to a specific course of action. Three governments, three interpretations of the same event, each shaped by its own strategic incentives. The actors involved are not new to this confrontation. Iran's political and military leadership have spent years calibrating a strategy built around indirect pressure, proxy networks, calculated ambiguity, and selective shows of force. Israel has positioned itself as the frontline state absorbing the immediate risk. The United States remains the security guarantor whose credibility is quietly being tested with every exchange. Gulf states, meanwhile, are neither combatants nor bystanders. They are calculating what this strike means for their own security arrangements. What makes this moment different is not the existence of conflict. That has persisted for years in various forms. It is the visibility of this particular action, stripped of the deniability that has defined so much of the shadow war preceding it. That visibility is not accidental. And to understand why Iran chose this moment and this method, we need to look further back at how deterrence in this region was built in the first place and why it has been slowly eroding long before this strike ever occurred. To understand why this strike represents a break from precedent, it helps to look at how the deterrence relationship between Iran, Israel, and the United States was originally built. Because it was never designed for direct confrontation. For most of the past 2 decades, this rivalry played out through a deliberate architecture of indirection. Iran's regional strategy emerged from a clear strategic calculation. Direct military confrontation with a technologically superior Israeli and American alliance carried enormous risk, while proxy warfare offered influence without the same exposure. Through networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, Iran extended its reach while maintaining a layer of deniability. Strikes could be attributed to allied groups rather than the Iranian state itself, allowing Tehran to project power while avoiding the kind of retaliation that direct action would invite. Israel, in turn, built its own doctrine around this same ambiguity. Covert operations, cyber sabotage, and targeted strikes against Iranian assets and personnel were conducted with limited public acknowledgement, allowing both sides to absorb losses without triggering the political pressure that comes from open war. This was, in effect, a shadow conflict. Intense, costly, but carefully bounded. That boundary began shifting in recent years. A series of direct strikes and counterstrikes, increasingly attributed openly rather than through proxies, signaled that the old rules of plausible deniability were weakening. Each exchange tested how far direct confrontation could go before triggering a wider regional war. Red lines that once seemed fixed were quietly redrawn, again and again, without either side fully acknowledging the shift. What made this restraint possible for so long was mutual uncertainty. Israel could not be entirely certain of Iran's full missile capability or intent. The United States could not be certain how far Iran was willing to go before stepping back. That uncertainty, paradoxically, kept escalation in check, because neither side wanted to test an unknown threshold at enormous cost. This latest strike removes a piece of that uncertainty. It does not merely continue the pattern of escalating direct exchanges. It demonstrates capability in a way that is far harder to dismiss or reinterpret. And once capability is demonstrated rather than assumed, the strategic calculations built around ambiguity no longer hold in the same way. This is the deeper significance of what happened. Not simply another strike in a long-running rivalry, but a moment that potentially closes the door on the deniability that made restraint possible for so long. To understand exactly what this strike reveals and why it matters to every actor watching, we need to look at the hidden strategic story behind it. Strip away the immediate headlines. And this strike reveals something more consequential than a single military action. It reveals a message, deliberately constructed and aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. The first audience was Israel. By demonstrating precision and reach against a specific target, Iran signaled that its missile program is not merely a defensive deterrent held in reserve, but an operational capability that can be employed with accuracy when Tehran chooses. For Israeli defense planners, this changes the calculus around missile defense allocation, early warning requirements, and the assumptions built into existing threat models. A capability that was previously theoretical now has to be treated as demonstrated fact. The second audience was Washington. For years, American strategy in the region has rested on an implicit assumption that the United States retains enough deterrent credibility to shape the boundaries of escalation, even when it is not the direct target of an exchange. This strike quietly tests that assumption. It asks, without asking directly, how far Iran can act before the United States is compelled to respond in a way that carries its own risks. Every choice Washington makes now, measured statements, diplomatic pressure, or something more direct, will be read by other regional actors as evidence of how much American deterrence is actually worth. The third audience is arguably the most overlooked, the Gulf states. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are not directly party to this exchange, but they are watching closely because their own security arrangements depend heavily on assumptions about Iranian capability and American reliability. If Iran can strike with this level of precision, and if the American response remains cautious, Gulf states may quietly recalibrate their own hedging strategies, deepening security ties elsewhere, or reconsidering how much they can rely on Washington's security umbrella in a genuine crisis. There is also a domestic dimension that should not be underestimated. Demonstrations of capability serve a political purpose within Iran itself, reinforcing a narrative of strength and strategic competence to a domestic audience navigating significant economic pressure. A visible, effective strike carries value at home that is separate from, but reinforcing of, its international signaling. Beyond the political messaging lies a harder intelligence question. Did Israeli and American intelligence services fully anticipate this capability? Or does this strike expose a gap between assumed and actual Iranian precision? This is a case where public statements are unlikely to reveal much. Governments rarely admit intelligence shortfalls directly. But the strategic behavior that follows, particularly any adjustments to missile defense posture or early warning systems, will offer indirect evidence of how significant that gap actually was. Economic considerations move in parallel with the military and diplomatic ones. Strikes of this nature, particularly ones perceived as capable of threatening energy infrastructure or shipping routes, tend to ripple through global energy markets almost immediately, regardless of whether the strike itself targeted energy assets directly. Markets price in probability, not certainty. and a demonstrated capability increases the perceived probability of future disruption, even without any change in stated intentions. What ties all of this together is a single strategic reality. This strike was never really about the target itself. It was about what the target represented. A demonstration engineered to be observed, interpreted, and reacted to by multiple audiences at once, each with different stakes and different thresholds for response. That is the deeper story beneath the headline. Not an isolated act of aggression, but a calculated signal designed to shift the assumptions of everyone watching, from Tel Aviv to Washington to the Gulf capitals quietly reassessing their own positions, and because so many actors are now recalculating simultaneously. The consequences of this single strike extend far beyond the immediate region, reshaping assumptions that will influence decisions for years to come. The consequences of a single demonstrated capability rarely stay contained to the moment it occurs. They ripple outward, reshaping assumptions across every level of the regional order, and this strike is no exception. For Israel, the immediate consequence is doctrinal. Missile defense systems are built around probabilistic assumptions: how many interceptors are needed, where they should be positioned, and what margin of error is acceptable. The demonstrated strike of this precision forces a reassessment of those assumptions, likely accelerating investment in layered defense systems and prompting a broader review of how Israeli planners model Iranian intent going forward. Tactically, no single strike is decisive. Strategically, it forces long-term recalibration that will outlast the news cycle. For the United States, the consequence is one of credibility rather than capability. Washington's regional influence depends less on the size of its military presence and more on the perception that its deterrent threats carry weight. If this strike proceeds without a response perceived as adequate by regional allies, it risks reinforcing a narrative already circulating among some Gulf partners that American security guarantees are more conditional than previously assumed. That perception, once established, is difficult to reverse, regardless of the accuracy of the underlying policy reasoning. Gulf states occupy a particularly delicate position. Their security architecture has long depended on layered hedging. American defense guarantees, regional diplomatic engagement, and increasingly direct communication channels with Tehran itself. A demonstrated Iranian missile capability absorbed without major consequence may accelerate an existing trend, Gulf states diversifying their security relationships rather than depending on any single guarantor. This does not necessarily mean abandoning American partnerships, but it does mean quietly building alternatives. Economically, the consequences extend beyond the immediate region. Energy markets respond to perceived risk as much as actual disruption and a demonstrated capability, even absent direct damage to energy infrastructure. Tends to elevate risk premiums built into oil and shipping insurance. These effects are often temporary, but they illustrate how a localized military event can carry global economic weight within hours. Politically, the strike also reshapes the international conversation. Diplomatic efforts around Iran's regional behavior, nuclear negotiations, and sanctions policy will now be conducted against a backdrop where deterrence has visibly shifted. Negotiating positions calibrated to a previous understanding of Iranian capability may need to be revisited, whether or not that revision is publicly acknowledged. What emerges from all of this is a pattern larger than any individual reaction: multiple independent actors, each recalculating their own risk models simultaneously, without necessarily coordinating those recalculations with one another. This is precisely how strategic environments shift, not through a single dramatic reversal, but through a series of quiet, parallel adjustments that collectively produce a new equilibrium. Whether that new equilibrium proves more stable or more volatile than the one it replaces is not yet clear. What is clear is that the assumptions guiding regional strategy before this strike no longer fully apply, and every major actor now has to decide how to operate in the space that remains. That uncertainty is precisely where the next phase of this story begins. With the old assumptions destabilized, attention now shifts to what comes next. And here, the honest answer is that multiple trajectories remain plausible, each carrying distinct risks and incentives for the actors involved. The first scenario is an escalation spiral. If Israel or the United States interprets the strike as requiring a proportional or symbolic response, and Iran in turn interprets that response as requiring further demonstration of resolve, the exchange could deepen into a cycle where each side feels compelled to answer the last move rather than de-escalate. Historically, this pattern has been avoided in the region precisely because of the ambiguity that has now been partially removed. Without that buffer, the margin for miscalculation narrows. This scenario carries the highest cost, but is not automatically the most likely. It requires specific triggering decisions on multiple sides. The second scenario is the emergence of a new, more dangerous equilibrium. One built not on ambiguity, but on mutually acknowledged capability. In this trajectory, all sides absorb the demonstrated strike, adjust their defense postures and deterrence assumptions accordingly, and settle into a tenser but ultimately stable standoff. This mirrors historical patterns from other rivalries, where demonstrated capability, once absorbed, eventually produces its own form of stability. A stability built on clarity rather than uncertainty. It is a colder peace, but a peace nonetheless. The third scenario involves diplomatic movement. Paradoxically, moments of demonstrated capability sometimes create openings for negotiation precisely because they clarify the stakes involved. If all sides recognize that continued escalation carries substantial and now clarified risk, back-channel diplomacy, whether through regional intermediaries or existing negotiation frameworks, may accelerate rather than stall. This scenario depends heavily on domestic political conditions in Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem, none of which are fully predictable from the outside. A fourth, quieter possibility deserves attention: strategic ambiguity reestablishing itself over time, even after a demonstrated capability. States can reintroduce uncertainty by deliberately obscuring subsequent actions, returning gradually to proxy-based or covert operations, rather than continuing with visible direct strikes. This would not undo what has already been demonstrated, but it could slow the pace at which further escalation occurs. Which path unfolds will likely depend on a small number of critical variables: whether Israel judges a response necessary for its own deterrent credibility, whether Washington calculates that restraint or visible support serves its interests more, and whether Gulf states apply quiet diplomatic pressure toward de-escalation given their own economic exposure to instability. None of these scenarios is guaranteed, and history offers examples of each unfolding in different contexts. What is more certain is that the strategic environment established over decades has been altered in a way that cannot simply be reset by a single diplomatic statement or a period of calm. The rules have changed. What remains to be seen is which actor adapts to that change most effectively, and which one continues operating on assumptions that no longer hold. Return for a moment to the question this documentary opened with: what happens to deterrence once the bluff is gone? The answer emerging from this strike is not that deterrence has collapsed, but that its foundation has shifted. For decades, restraint in this region was maintained through uncertainty, through what each side assumed the other might do, rather than what had actually been demonstrated. That uncertainty is now, at least partially, gone. What replaces it is a colder, more explicit form of calculation, where capability is known rather than guessed, and where every future move will be measured against a clearer baseline than existed before. This is the paradox worth sitting with. Demonstrated capability can, in theory, produce a more stable standoff, one grounded in mutual clarity rather than mutual guesswork, but it can just as easily accelerate the very escalation it was meant to prevent, particularly if any single actor misjudges how the others will respond to that new clarity. History offers examples of both outcomes, and nothing about this moment guarantees which path this rivalry will take. What is certain is that Israel, the United States, Iran, and the Gulf states are no longer operating under the same assumptions that governed their behavior just weeks ago. Defense postures are being quietly reassessed. Diplomatic calculations are being revisited. And trust in long-standing security guarantees is being tested in ways that may not become fully visible for months or even years. Deterrence, in other words, has not disappeared. It has simply become something else. Less forgiving of miscalculation, less dependent on ambiguity, and far less predictable in how it will hold. The question now is not whether the rules have changed. They clearly have. The real question is who recognizes that shift quickly enough to adapt, and who continues making decisions based on a version of deterrence that no longer exists.